Hey everybody, new mug, pour me another cup. This week we are talking about poetry, form, and free verse. Free verse poetry is poetry that is free from any kinds of restrictions, guidelines. That's not to say that there aren't things that make it poetic, and that's kind of complicated to talk about, but we'll get there. And form poetry is harder to write. Sometimes it's harder to read. It's often the kind of poetry that we remember learning about because form poetry was the established way to write poetry for centuries. Shakespeare wrote in form. You know, a lot of the great poets, great old poets, wrote in some kind of form. Even Dante's Inferno is in terza rima. It's rhymed three-line stanzas. But when we talk about form, when we name a form, it comes with a set of guidelines or expectations, not unlike music. If we say that a song is a rap song, we'd have some expectations. If we're aiming to write a rap song, there are some guidelines that we have to follow for it to be a rap song. Same with country music, same with a rock ballad, something like that. In poetry, these are much more established and probably for the most part more restrictive. But every time that we say the name of a form, like a villanelle, a haiku, a ballad, or a rhyme royal, something like that, there's a set of rules or a set of guidelines that come with that name. In order to write a poem like that, you have to follow those, or you have to meet a set of expectations for it to be considered that. There's a lot of different reasons to do this. One, it participates in a larger tradition. It enhances meaning in particular ways. Some forms of poems have meaning built, like sonnets tend to have a turn at the bottom where it builds our expectations for the three quatrains, and then at the very bottom, the last two lines, it switches its expectation, defies our expectation, gives us a turn. So it can be good for that. It can be good for lots of different reasons. But we're going to talk about what the forms are and how to understand them. So the easiest form and the smallest form, and one of the more basic forms, is the haiku. It's very, very old form. It's Chinese in its origin. And it's just 3 lines, very short poems. They're often about nature, but they don't have to be. And they have a syllabic structure. And we talked about syllabics last week a little bit. You just count the syllables, and it has a set number of syllables for each line, 5, 7, 5. So I'm going to show you some haiku that are actually mine, and we'll talk a little bit about what makes it a haiku. So I had these published a long time ago in a press that I work with now. But they are actually a little bit about nature, so it fits that standard. And you can see one of the neat things that you can do with haiku is that you can combine them to make a longer poem made out of multiple haikus. There's also a form called a haibun, which is a haiku with a prose poem underneath it. We can talk about that some other time. But I'll read these real quick and then we'll talk about them. Water boils for tea. My mother watches a bird rest, weary from flight. I shiver from air felt around the window pane, frost in the corner. A fire is built with wood stacked since September neatly under eaves. So for these, each individual stanzas or each individual haiku to be a haiku, it needs to have 3 lines, it needs to have 5, 7, 5. So if you look at the first one, you can clap through them or you can count them, whatever. Syllables are units of sound and pronunciation. We learned this a long time ago, probably in elementary school when we were still talking about language skills. But when you clap through a sentence, you can count the number of syllables, and they're units built around vowels. None of that really matters. We do this naturally. So water boils for tea. Water boils for tea. 5. I almost put an extra syllable in there. My mother watches a bird. There should be 7 there, right? My mother watches a bird. 7. Rest, weary from flight. 5. 5, 7, 5. And you can do that in each of those stanzas. So each of those little poems, which I've combined to make a longer poem, fit the standard of a haiku. 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first, 7 syllables in the second, 5 syllables in the last. Pretty easy. What you have to do when you're writing something like this is you have to figure out what you want to say first, get it close, and then start playing with the language so that it matches the number of syllables. So when I first wrote this poem, the first line might have easily said, I boil some water, or I boil water, I boil water. It's not I boil water, right? 4, so I'm off. Water boils for tea. And then you have to play with that a little bit to meet those guidelines and meet those characteristics that are expected for that form. It becomes a little more complicated when you are dealing with more complex forms. A pretty complex form, nothing like a villanelle or a sestina. You don't have to even read about sestinas, but the sonnet is pretty complex. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to reshare with the sonnet. This is the sonnet 29 that you read out of your book for today. You read a different sonnet last week. This was out of the reading selection today, the plunging in. And this is sonnet 29. Sonnets have a bunch of characteristics that make them sonnets. One is how many lines. Much like haikus have 3, sonnets have 14. It's divided into 3 stanzas with 4 lines each, and then a couplet at the bottom with 2 lines. So Shakespeare didn't often divide them. A lot of people do, some people don't, but we can still split these. So 1 stanza of 4 lines, another stanza of 4 lines, 3rd stanza of 4 lines, that's 12, and then a couplet at the bottom. We call stanzas with 4 lines quatrains because they have 4 lines, and stanzas with 2 lines couplets because there's just 2. So there's our 14 lines. That's the first characteristic. The other things that a sonnet needs to do, Shakespearean sonnets specifically, is that they need to match a particular rhyme scheme that's unique to Shakespearean sonnets or English sonnets, not Italian sonnets, they're a little different. And they have to have a rhythm. And they have to have a rhythm and meter that's consistent. Sonnets, all sonnets, and especially Shakespearean English sonnets, use the meter of iambic pentameter. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But how do we recognize rhymes? So rhyming and mapping rhyme is actually pretty easy. You can map any poem that has rhyme, and you do it in a pattern of letters. So I can tell you that Shakespearean sonnets with their 14 lines have the rhyme scheme of AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, and GG. Well, that seems to look a little weird, doesn't it? Well, yes, it does. But you'll see that it's split up for each of the quatrains. 3 quatrains, right? And there's a pattern for each of those and then the couplet at the end. So what we'll do is actually map this out. And you can do this on any poem. You can just use letters, and the letters represent repeating sounds to represent the rhyme scheme. So in this first stanza, we have the word eyes, state, cries, and fate. Those are the ending sounds that we want to map out the pattern of rhyme in. So if eyes is A, we mark eyes with A. State does not rhyme with eyes, so that's a different sound. We'll say that's B. Cries, though, cries rhymes with eyes. So we'll mark that A. Fate rhymes with state, we'll mark that B. A, B, A, B. That's the beginning of the rhyme pattern. And any poem that rhymes, you can use letters like that to show how the pattern develops. Next stanza, hope. That doesn't rhyme with eyes or state, so it's a new sound. So we'll identify that with C. Possessed, that doesn't rhyme. That's a new sound. We'll mark that with D. Scope, oh, that rhymes with hope. C. And least. Least is a loose rhyme with possessed, or what we might call a slant rhyme. The words don't officially rhyme, but there's enough of a sound similarity at the end that Shakespeare's using a little bit of his freedom or his poetic license there. And who are we to tell Shakespeare that he can't? Then we have despising, state, arising, and gate. Despising doesn't match anything, so that's new. E, state, F, arising, E, and gate, F. You will notice that state and fate in the earlier stanza, the first stanza, do match, but they don't have to. So we could mark that as EB, EB, but that's not the rule. It can be a different rhyme here. Shakespeare just happened to use the same. So EF, EF, and then brings and kings. Those don't rhyme. That's a new rhyme. And they rhyme with each other. So G, G. So all we've done is just mark the sounds and mark where they repeat. And then we put it up here in this pattern, the A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. And that is the rhyme scheme. Shakespearean sonnets follow that rhyme scheme. And if you write a Shakespearean sonnet, Your poem has to rhyme in that pattern. Easy enough, right? Well, what else needs to happen? When you have the lines, you have the rhyme, it also needs to be in a particular meter. We call this meter iambic pentameter, and that's a little trickier. When we're reading for meter and rhyme, we call the process of reading scansion. We're trying to note the rhythm and note the rhymes and note the patterns in which syllables are occurring. So most simply, when we're looking for syllables, they appear in places like haiku, right? We already did that, 575. Those are single syllables. When we start to look at how syllables work together, we call them feet. A foot is a unit of syllables, how 2 syllables or sometimes 3 syllables come together to make a sound. Or how individual syllables sound when they're read together. So I'll read that first line from the sonnet that we were just looking at. I think that you can't see the paper that I need you to see. Hang on, I'm gonna reshare. Sorry, you couldn't see the paper that I needed you to see. So we're talking about feet here. So let's read that first line and look for the syllables and the pattern of sounds that they're making together. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, okay, there are some syllables there, and when they're pushed together, when they're read together, they form a pattern. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, we can feel that pattern. So the feet there are the sounds when they're together. For example, when in, those first 2 syllables together, they fit and make a rhythm, and that rhythm is tatum, when in, and it's repeated with disgrace. Disgrace, with fortune, and men's eyes. Okay, so we have those feet, that combination of syllables, the way that those syllables sound together, and they form the same pattern. And that pattern is unstressed, stressed. When we read syllables together, and usually when we read and when we write, we often read in unstressed, stressed, or we write things or we talk in unstressed, stressed because of the way that we build syllables. This is a pretty natural meter. But unstressed, stressed means that it's, when we read it, that's how it sounds. When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. You could try to reverse it and make it stress, stress, and it's not going to sound right. It would be when in disgrace with fortune. See, you can't really. So that's the natural sound that makes. And the way that we structure syllables in conversation, it often comes out like this. Other feet patterns are tougher. And there's a lot of different kinds. But when the syllable pattern is 2 syllables going unstressed, stressed, we call that an iamb. That's how we label that pattern. So if it's backwards, if it would be tum-ta, it would be a trochee. Don't have to worry about that. You don't have to memorize any of that. You just have to be able to look it up. And the page range in your book has some of that. And really the only thing that you're concerned with right now is iambic pentameter anyway. So unstressed, stressed is 1 foot, 2 syllables, 1 foot, and it's an iamb because of the pattern that it's making. And then for a meter, we have to figure out how many times that feet appears per line. So how many syllables total? When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. There's 10 syllables there total, 5 feet, 5 double syllable patterns. So that's 5 feet per line, pentameter, iambic pentameter. 5 of those repetitions per line. And every line in that sonnet matches that. In fact, Shakespeare writes in that, even in a lot of his plays and comedies, royalty tend to speak in iambic pentameter, which he also calls, if it's iambic pentameter without rhyme, he would call it blank verse. And I just want to find you a page number real quick. I wrote this down for you, but if you look in your book under traditional rhythms, pages 252 to 261, it tells you more about this. There's a list of different kinds of stress patterns and what you would call them, especially pages 256 to 257. Like I said, you don't have to remember any of these. I don't remember them. I look them up if I need to know them. But when you're writing a sonnet, you need to know how to write an iambic pentameter. I gave you another link or two about this too. It's tough, but it's once you realize how to do it, and once you kind of start doing it, it becomes much easier and much more natural. So that's a different form entirely. Much more complex than haiku, but if you can do it, it can be really rewarding. Hitting that kind of rhythm, hitting that meter, hitting that rhyme, that can be really great. And sometimes it helps us write poems that we might not otherwise write, as we're forced to kind of match those conventions. The alternative then, the other half of this, is free verse, where there is no set number of lines, there's no set rhythm, there's no set meter, there's no set rhyme. I think I already said that. There's nothing. It's just, you know, it's a free-for-all. It's free verse. But that doesn't mean that there are no patterns, right? There are still several patterns, and you read about this a little bit. And there's still choices in enjambment, you know, where you cut a line, or if you end stop a line, where you would have a sentence ends at a line in a poem. So we'll take a look here. I'm not going to read this for you. And again, disclosure for language and sexual imagery in this poem. Hopefully you heard Ginsberg read it. And we can talk a little bit about how this free verse poem is still doing things that are poetic. If you look at the first couple lines, we'll just read the first couple lines. America, I've given you all and now I'm nothing. America, $2.27, January 17th, 1956. You can already see what he's doing and how he's trying to use the sounds to create an image or to deliver a message or to create some kind of meaning or to give us an impact. You have a hard time finding meaning in poems like this, that's fine, but we're still impacted in particular ways, and that is meaningful. But we have this, what we call an anaphora at the beginning too, that repetition of words or sounds at the beginning of a line. America, I've given you all and now I'm nothing. America, $2.27, January 17th, 1956. He could have written that without the repetition of America. The poem's called America. We want to have that name echoing in our mind. A couple lines later, when will you take off your clothes? When will you look at yourself through the grave? When will you be worthy of your million Trotskyites? It's not rhyme, it's not meter, but there's sound there, right? That's creating meaning and giving us a certain way to read the poem and to think about the poem. You can hear him when he reads this too. If you haven't yet, go back and do it. You can hear the way that he reads some things are represented by the way that he breaks and develops the text itself too. Anyway, you don't have to like it. It is important. This is a pretty important poem. The history behind it's really interesting if you have time to look at that. But it's a good example of free verse poetry. When Ginsberg was writing this in the 50s, the beat poets were doing things that other people discarded. A lot of contemporary poets at the time and a lot of the people who came before them thought that this wasn't really poetry, right? Because they would go and read it at jazz clubs because it doesn't have form and it's free, and so it has more to do with the rhythm and the way that you read it and the way that you talk and the way that you develop sounds rather than fitting a fixed form, not unlike jazz. But some people don't like it. It's not for everybody, and that's fine too. Or free verse might be for you, but Ginsberg isn't, and that's okay too. You wouldn't be alone. Anyway, hope you enjoy this stuff, and we'll talk soon. Good luck. Bye.